Germany was in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, families torn apart. And in the final desperate months of war, even women were dragged into uniforms, forced to hold together a collapsing empire. They were told to expect one thing above all if captured: merciless brutality. They had been taught to expect the absolute worst: brutality, vengeance, and a future stripped bare. Yet as these German women prisoners, conscripted and coerced into Hitler's collapsing war machine, were marched into Allied camps, they encountered something far more terrifying than any torture they could have imagined: unexpected kindness. This wasn't just an act of mercy, it was a psychological weapon, dismantling years of fervent indoctrination, leaving them reeling and questioning everything they thought they knew. Imagine their confusion. For months they had endured starvation, the constant threat of death, and the crushing weight of a war lost. Their world was one of suspicion and fear. Now, captured by the very enemy they were told were monsters, they braced for the inevitable horror. But it didn't come. Instead, they were given clean, if basic, quarters. Rations, while not luxurious, were adequate and consistent, a stark contrast to the gnawing hunger that had become their daily companion. Medical attention, when needed, was provided without question. This initial shock was merely the prelude. The true revelation, the act that would shatter their carefully constructed worldview, began with something far more insidious than simple provision. It was the way they were treated, not as symbols of a defeated, monstrous regime, but as individuals. The American Guards, far from the brutal, vengeful automatons of propaganda, maintained a stark, almost unsettling professionalism. There were no taunts, no gratuitous displays of power. Their commands were firm but devoid of malice. This wasn't the enemy they had been prepared for. Their captors didn't fit the narrative. Every gesture, every neutral interaction, chipped away at the edifice of hate and fear built over years of state-sponsored lies. How could these men, the supposed embodiment of evil, behave with such dispassionate decency? It defied every fiber of their ingrained belief. These women, many barely out of their teens, had been steeped in the ideology of the Third Reich. They had volunteered or been conscripted into auxiliary roles, operating anti-aircraft guns, serving as communications officers, performing vital logistical tasks. Their loyalty, whether born of conviction or sheer terror, had been absolute. They believed in the righteousness of their cause, in the depravity of their enemies. Now, that carefully constructed reality was under assault, not by force, but by a quiet, persistent humanity. It was a cognitive dissonance that tore at their very souls. They watched, bewildered, as American doctors treated their sick with the same care they might afford their own soldiers. They received letters from home, censored but delivered, a small thread connecting them to a world they thought was lost forever. They were allowed to congregate, to speak amongst themselves, to process the bewildering turn of events. This wasn't the hell they had anticipated. It was something far more unnerving. What did it mean to be treated with respect by the very people you had been taught to despise? What did it say about the regime that had instilled such venomous fear? The silence was often more unsettling than any shouts. The absence of expected brutality left a void, a space where doubt began to fester. They searched for ulterior motives, for the hidden traps, the moment when the mask would slip and the true monster would emerge. But it never did. There was no grand theatrical display of generosity, just the steady, unwavering application of military protocol and a surprising adherence to the Geneva Conventions, even for women who were technically non-combatants but had served the enemy. This wasn't the victory parade of a cruel conqueror. It was something else entirely. It was bewildering. The emotional toll was immense. For years, their identity had been inextricably linked to the Reich, to the struggle, to the image of an enemy that was pure evil. Now, that enemy was providing them with sustenance, medical care, and a semblance of order. Their world was tilting on its axis. The propaganda had painted a vivid picture of American barbarity, of vengeance-driven soldiers who would exact a terrible price. Instead, they found a chilling professionalism that offered no easy answers, no clear-cut villain to despise. This wasn't just about physical survival, it was about the survival of their belief system itself. And that was far more terrifying than any physical threat. The emotional toll was immense. For years, their identity had been inextricably linked to the Reich, to the struggle, to the image of an enemy that was pure evil. Now that enemy was providing them with sustenance, medical care, and a semblance of order. Their world was tilting on its axis. The propaganda had painted a vivid picture of American barbarity, of vengeance-driven soldiers who would exact a terrible price. Instead, they found a chilling professionalism that offered no easy answers, no clear-cut villain to despise. This wasn't just about physical survival, it was about the survival of their belief system itself, and that was far more terrifying than any physical threat. The true revelation, the act that would truly unravel their carefully constructed reality, wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the insidious, persistent drip of truth, slowly eroding the foundations of their indoctrination. The Americans began to provide them with something far more dangerous than physical comfort: information. Not propaganda, but facts. Newspapers, uncensored and in German, began to appear in the camps. They detailed the atrocities committed by the regime they had served. They spoke of concentration camps, of systematic extermination, of a war fought not just for national glory, but for monstrous ideologies. Imagine the horror. These women, many of whom had lived in a bubble of carefully curated lies, were confronted with photographic evidence, with survivor testimonies, with the unvarnished truth of their nation's crimes. Their minds reeled. Was it possible? Could everything they had been taught, every sacrifice demanded, every enemy demonized, have been a lie? The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Their captors, the supposed monsters, were now the purveyors of a brutal reality that implicated their own leaders, their own families, perhaps even themselves. The guards, still professional, still distant, offered no commentary. Their silence was a powerful tool, allowing the women to grapple with these revelations alone, in the echo chamber of their own shattered beliefs. Each headline, each article, was a hammer blow to their certainty. The enemy they had been told to despise was showing them a mirror, reflecting a truth so grotesque it threatened to consume them. How could they reconcile the image of a benevolent, orderly regime with the images of emaciated bodies piled high in death camps? The weight of this knowledge pressed down, heavier than any physical chains. It wasn't just the newspapers. Educational programs, albeit rudimentary, were introduced. Discussions were encouraged, not about military strategy, but about civic responsibility, about the dangers of unchecked power, about the very principles of democracy. For women who had known only rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience, this was revolutionary. They were being asked to think, to question, to engage with ideas that directly contradicted a decade of totalitarian control. The seeds of doubt, planted by unexpected kindness, now blossomed into a terrifying garden of self-reflection and existential dread. The emotional impact was profound. Some retreated into denial, clinging to the last vestiges of their former beliefs, unable to accept such a devastating betrayal. Others wept, not for their defeat, but for the profound deception they had endured. A gnawing sense of shame began to replace their initial fear. They had been tools, unwitting or not, in a machine of unimaginable evil. The kindness of their American captors, once bewildering, now felt like a stark indictment, highlighting the moral void of their own recent past. This was the true psychological warfare. Not torture, but truth. Not vengeance, but a quiet, relentless dismantling of a worldview built on hate and lies. The Americans weren't just winning the war, they were fighting for the minds of the defeated, offering a path, however painful, towards a different future. But first, these women had to confront the unbearable weight of what they had been made to believe, and the horrifying reality of what had truly transpired. The process was agonizing, but it was also, for many, the very first step towards true liberation, a liberation of the mind from the shackles of indoctrination. The initial horror gave way to a profound, unsettling silence. Conversations that once revolved around the mundane anxieties of captivity or faint hopes for release now turned inward, hushed and heavy with unspoken questions. Some women retreated, their eyes vacant, their spirits crushed by the weight of revelation. They simply could not reconcile the world they had believed in with the atrocities now laid bare. Their minds, once so firmly anchored by propaganda, drifted in a sea of despair. Denial was a powerful opiate, a last-ditch defense against a truth too terrible to bear. But for others, a different kind of awakening began. Slowly, tentatively, they started to speak. Not about the enemy, but about themselves. About the slogans they had chanted, the parades they had marched in, the unquestioning loyalty they had offered. A chilling realization dawned. They had been complicit, not just in supporting a regime, but in enabling a horror. The shame was a visceral thing, a burning in their gut that far surpassed the fear of any American guard. It was the shame of having believed, of having been used, of having closed their eyes to the whispers of darkness. The American approach, subtle yet relentless, continued. They introduced lectures, not punitive interrogations, but discussions led by German émigrés or former prisoners of the regime. These weren't accusatory sessions. They were educational, designed to foster critical thinking, to dissect the mechanisms of totalitarian control. The women listened, some with hostility, some with a dawning, terrifying clarity. They learned about the Weimar Republic, about the rise of fascism, about the gradual erosion of individual liberties. It was a history lesson, yes, but one that resonated with the chilling echo of their own recent past. This wasn't just about facts. It was about empathy. Stories of victims, shared in stark, unembellished detail, began to penetrate the hardened shell of their indoctrination. The abstract concept of the enemy shattered into countless individual tragedies. A Jewish family, a political dissident, a Roma child. These were not enemies, but human beings, brutally extinguished. The women began to see faces, not caricatures. The emotional impact was overwhelming, transforming their shame into a profound sense of grief, not just for the victims, but for the moral bankruptcy of their own nation. The camp environment, while still disciplined, began to subtly shift. Books previously censored or banned by the Reich were now made available. Literature, philosophy, art, avenues of thought that had been systematically suppressed, were reopened. For many, it was their first encounter with intellectual freedom, with the idea that there could be multiple perspectives, that truth was not a monolithic decree from above. This intellectual reawakening was slow, painful, and often fraught with internal conflict. But it was happening. They were being given a choice, implicitly, not just to survive, but to truly understand. The kindness of their captors, once so bewildering, now took on a new, heavier meaning. It wasn't just a lack of brutality, it was an active invitation to humanity, to rebuild, to atone. The American guards, still professional, still distant, served as a constant, quiet counter-narrative to everything they had been taught. Their very presence, devoid of the expected cruelty, was a living testament to a different way of being. This process of de-indoctrination was deeply personal, yet it also fractured the group. Some women clung fiercely to their old beliefs, dismissing the information as Allied propaganda, another layer of lies. They resented the Americans, not for their brutality, but for their unsettling decency, for forcing them to confront such uncomfortable truths. These women became isolated, their anger a shield against the pain of re-evaluation. They whispered of eventual retribution, of a stab-in-the-back myth already forming in the ashes of defeat. But the majority, slowly, painfully, began to grapple with their new reality. They started to question the very foundations of their identity. Who were they, if not loyal daughters of the Reich? What did it mean to be German, if their nation had perpetrated such horrors? The future, once a terrifying blank, now seemed even more daunting. They had to forge a new identity, not just as survivors, but as individuals burdened by a collective guilt, yet offered a glimmer of hope for redemption. The call to action, though unstated, was clear: to acknowledge, to understand, and to ensure such darkness never rose again. The Americans were not just guarding prisoners. They were, in their own quiet way, sowing the seeds of a new Germany. A Germany built not on blind obedience and hatred, but on critical thought, empathy, and a profound respect for human dignity. These women, once instruments of war, were now unwilling participants in an unprecedented experiment, the rebuilding of a shattered soul, one conscience at a time. This was the true enduring shock, not the end of a war, but the beginning of an agonizing yet necessary truth. The weight of their nation's crimes, once an abstract concept from enemy propaganda, now pressed down with suffocating clarity. For some, it triggered a profound moral paralysis. They moved through their days in a daze, the simple acts of eating or sleeping overshadowed by the grotesque images and damning testimonies that now haunted their minds. How could they have been so blind? How could they have been so willingly deceived? The very air in the camp seemed to thicken with their unspoken questions, their collective shame. It was a silence louder than any battlefield roar. But for others, this crushing despair slowly began to forge a different kind of resolve. They sought out the newspapers, devouring every article, every grim detail, as if punishing themselves with the truth. They engaged in the discussions, at first hesitantly, then with a desperate urgency, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of their understanding. They argued, they questioned, they wept. This wasn't just about Germany. It was about the human capacity for evil and their own unwitting role in its rise. The quiet professionalism of the American Guards, once bewildering, now felt like a constant, stark reminder of an alternative, a world where decency, even in victory, was possible. The educational programs expanded, offering not just facts but frameworks for understanding. Lessons in civics and history were presented, not as dogma, but as tools for critical thought. They learned about checks and balances, about individual rights, about the dangers of charismatic leaders, and the seductive power of nationalism. For women raised on unquestioning obedience, where the state was paramount and dissent was treason, these concepts were revolutionary. They were being asked to dismantle a lifetime of ingrained beliefs, to rebuild their mental landscapes from the ground up, brick by agonizing brick. It was an intellectual battle far more grueling than any physical one. They began to observe their American captors with new eyes. No longer just the enemy, but individuals. They saw moments of human connection. A guard sharing a laugh with a comrade, a medic tending to a sick child in a nearby displaced persons camp. These small, mundane observations chipped away at the monolithic image of the brutal foe, revealing complexity, humanity. It wasn't about liking them. It was about understanding that the world was not divided into absolute good and evil, as their propaganda had insisted. This nuanced reality was terrifying, yet also liberating. The internal divisions within the camp deepened. Some women remained fiercely loyal to the Nazi ideal, their minds slamming shut against the onslaught of truth. They saw the newspapers as fabrications, the lectures as insidious brainwashing. They clung to the narrative of a heroic Germany betrayed, a nation victimized by vengeful conquerors. Their eyes held a defiance born of fear, a desperate refusal to acknowledge the moral abyss. These women often isolated themselves, whispering in corners, finding solace in shared denial, reinforcing each other's resistance to the unbearable truth. But the majority found themselves on a different, more painful journey. They began to share their own stories, not of combat, but of life under the regime. The subtle pressures, the omnipresent fear, the slow erosion of personal freedom. They spoke of the indoctrination of their youth, the promises of glory, the pervasive fear of the Gestapo. This shared vulnerability created a fragile new bond, a recognition that they had all been pawns, manipulated by a monstrous ideology. The shame became a shared burden, and in that sharing, a faint glimmer of understanding and perhaps forgiveness began to emerge. The availability of previously banned books was a quiet revolution. German classics, forbidden foreign literature, philosophical texts. These volumes offered escape, but also new perspectives. Women who had known only censored newsreels and state-approved texts now encountered ideas that challenged everything. They read, debated, and discovered the richness of thought that had been deliberately withheld from them. It was a rediscovery of intellect, a reawakening of individual curiosity, an act of defiance against the mental shackles of their past. The process was not linear. There were days of profound clarity, followed by days of crushing doubt, moments of anger at their former leaders, interspersed with moments of anger at their captors for forcing them to confront such unbearable truths. The emotional landscape of the camp was a turbulent sea, churning with grief, shame, confusion, and a burgeoning, terrifying sense of individual responsibility. They were no longer just prisoners of war, they were prisoners of their own shattered illusions. Their American captors, with their unwavering protocols and dispassionate decency, continued to hold up a mirror. They offered no easy answers, no comforting narratives. They simply provided the tools, the facts, the forums for discussion, the books, and allowed the women to grapple with the consequences. This was not a punitive act, but an educational one, a calculated effort to foster a new kind of citizenry from the ashes of totalitarianism. It was an audacious gamble, a belief that even deeply indoctrinated minds could be guided towards self-reflection and, ultimately, towards a better future. The question that now haunted them was not just what happened, but what now? Their old world was gone, shattered beyond repair. Their identity as loyal German women of the Reich was a lie. They faced a future where they would have to live with the knowledge of their nation's atrocities, with the burden of collective guilt. But within that burden, the unexpected kindness of their captors, the relentless drip of truth, had also planted a seed, the possibility of understanding, of atonement, of building something new from the ruins of their shattered beliefs. This was the true, agonizing liberation. The agonizing liberation was indeed a new beginning. As the war concluded and the camps emptied, these women, profoundly changed, stepped back into a devastated Germany. They carried not just war's trauma, but truth's unsettling burden. American kindness had stripped away layers of lies, forcing them to confront a reality far more brutal than any enemy propaganda. No longer blindly loyal daughters of the Reich, they were individuals grappling with a shattered past and an uncertain future, forever marked by camp revelations. For many, de-indoctrination continued long after release. Critical thought, planted by uncensored newspapers and open discussions, blossomed into a lifelong quest for understanding. They became quiet architects of a new Germany, built on accountability and remembrance, not denial and hatred. They understood propaganda's insidious power and the vital importance of questioning authority. Their captors' unexpected decency showed them that even in darkness, humanity could prevail, offering reconciliation where vengeance was expected. The questions "what happened" and "what now" found answers in years of introspection. True strength, they learned, lay not in blind obedience, but in the courage to face uncomfortable truths. The most powerful weapon of their American captors wasn't a gun, but the quiet, persistent application of decency and truth, dismantling a monstrous ideology one conscience at a time. This wasn't merely about winning a war, it was about winning back a people's soul. And thus, the astonishing story of these German women prisoners, bracing for brutality, instead found an unsettling kindness that shattered their world. It forced them to confront their defeat and the moral bankruptcy of the regime they had served. Their initial fear yielded to shame, then grief, and finally, for many, to a profound commitment for a future where such atrocities could never again take root. Therefore, this period reminds us that even amidst war, truth and unexpected humanity can pierce indoctrination. The greatest victories are often won not on the battlefield, but within the human mind, challenging us all to question what we believe and why. If this exploration resonated, hit like, comment, and subscribe for more untold histories.